Hello and welcome to another episode of Timesglo podcast. Today we are pleased to have Mr. Stephen Jensen, who is a former war veteran and who is a management consultant based in London and speaks really, vocal. He is very vocal on Twitter about what's happening in Afghanistan right now and what happened, and he tries to, prove his claims with visuals. He shares a lot of pictures on Twitter as well. You can follow him, Stephen, with the Twitter handle Stephen A. Jensen. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time and
Thank
once
you.
again being on our show.
Thank you so much for inviting me back in, and really enjoyed our last conversation and looking forward to this one as well.
So before going into conversation, we have decided to talk. Our This podcast would be mainly, discussing two topics. One is that how this false narrative have been, said again and again. The way that tribal society, Afghan tribal society, is being, confused with the uh, Taliban type of tribal society. Was it that much rigid? What was the culture before? How the nationalism was in Afghanistan before the Soviets came into Afghanistan. So this is one of the topics that we would be touching upon. The second is that how quite suddenly Afghan forces surrendered. Just after NATO forces or American forces left Afghanistan. Uh, s- let us, Stephen, discuss the first point, that is, was the Afghan society just like being portrayed now? Was it, this the culture of the Afghan society, that is being said that this Taliban culture is the actual culture of the society? What's your views on it?
So obviously, I'm not from Afghanistan, so I can't speak sort of about Afghanistan as my culture, and I don't want to. But what I would say, as from an historical perspective, the Taliban is a very new phenomenon, and I think they have a very strong desire to be seen as the kind of guardians of tradition and the guardians of the past and the guardians of the kind of conservative and stable society. But I think that's complete nonsense.
You think that's the
They,
Taliban's propaganda?
I think it's absolutely the Taliban's propaganda. In a way, it's their claim to legitimacy, but it's a false claim to legitimacy. I think in some ways it's comparable, I think, to some, for example, Western fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s, where they are, very explicitly kind of drawing on some traditional aspects of society or traditional symbols of society or symbols of traditionalism, and trying to kind of present themselves as a kind of we are here to bring back the pure and the old and the ancient, and sort of bring it back into being. But of course, there are completely modern phenomenon, and a completely modern phenomenon that is bred of a specific time and context, and could never have come into existence, barring that very specific context. I think if you think about Europe in the 1920s and 30s, that context is the sort of chaotic period after World War One, where people are worrying about the rise of communism, people have economic problems, people are dealing with the kind of the shame of having lost the war, and all these kinds of issues. And in Afghanistan in the early 1990s, the situation is really the aftermath of the war with against the communists, with the Soviet Union, where despite having ostensibly won that war, at least the Mujahideen, the failure to have to reestablish a kind of ordered governance, the rise of all these kind of militias and former Mujahideen commanders that really behaved in a sort of absolutely atrocious fashion, especially in some parts of the country, led to the rise of the Taliban from that specific context. Both the fact you have quite a few people who have been part of the anti-communist jihad, very strongly identified with that, but also the fact that there's a kind of breakdown, not just in traditional society, but in kind of all society. Not across all Afghanistan, but specifically in the south. So I mean, in the north, you had the kind of, in the north and the west, you had a much more kind of orderly situation, a degree of fragmentation from the center and so on. But especially in Kandahar, where the Taliban kind of emerged, had total anarchy, very, very violent, very unsecure.
We discussed in our previous podcast that this radical Islamism was brought to Afghanistan by academics in the 60s. To fight against the Soviets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is the Taliban's brand of Islamism. It clearly is a kind of form of radical Islamism. It is a slightly different brand of it than the more kind of academic Muslim Brotherhood type Islamism that came from the Middle East, but it's very tightly connected. And you see there's a kind of a cross-fertilization intellectually, some of it happening in the kind of madrasas with, different sort of Malawis coming in different ways and so on. But I think the really, really radical, I mean, absolutely radical modern invention of the Taliban in Afghanistan, something that's never been seen before in the history of Afghanistan, this idea of kind of theocracy, that is a sort of Islamist way of thinking about government. That the government is sort of purely, there's no earthly authority that is sort of separate from, or God. There's no king, there's no parliament, there's no nothing like that. All of it is kind of mullahs or imams or whatever. There's no precedent for this in Afghanistan historically. And that I think speaks to the radicalism of the Taliban, that it is a very, very modern thing that.
Sorry, there's a distortion in your voice, Stephen.
Yeah, can you hear it? What should I do?
I think there is a network problem. There is a distortion. Yes, would you please continue?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can't hear you.
Should I log out and log in, or?
Yes, you can join again. You can change your connection, disconnect and connect.
Did that help? Are you there?
Hello, Stephen.
Hi, can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's now better.
Okay, yeah. Let's if you just repeat the last question, then we can restart from that point, maybe.
I was saying that this traditionalism was that that was brought in the 60s by academics in Afghanistan, That was not their their actual tradition. That didn't have any roots in Afghanistan
Yeah, yeah,
previously.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so exactly. So I mean, or I would call it the Islamism or the radical Islamism. Now, obviously,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that everything the Taliban does and claims to represent and so on is sort of foreign, or obviously they are drawing on lots of things in Afghanistan's past. But I think the way they are expressing that politically and the way they are expressing that culturally is a very, very modern way. And it reflects a lot of that kind of intellectual heritage from the radical Islamists from the Middle East.
And people
Saddam
have
Hussein.
accepted that narrative, the Taliban's narrative, that
Completely.
have been here, and this was part of our tradition. The Afghan
Yeah,
society was like this, and this
yeah.
have been bought by the people,
Completely,
by the
completely,
by the countries as well during Doha
completely,
dialogue.
completely. And I think even worse. I think there, many in the West, especially kind of journalists, especially anti-war people, accepted even the Taliban narrative that they were some sort of kind of nationalist resistance, that they were kind of basically a legitimate form of resistance against the kind of foreign oppressor. If you read the polling data, very, very few Afghans agree with this point of view. They don't see the Taliban as a kind of national liberation movement. They see the Taliban as the Taliban. They see them as an extreme right wing. Right wing would be a Western way of seeing it, but the vast majority of Afghans, if you read the polling data, the actual research where people go and ask thousands and thousands and thousands of people, like, how do you look at these issues? A very small portion of the population support the Taliban. Somewhere between 4 and 15% before the takeover, and they see them as a radical right-wing movement, not as a kind of something, not as a national thing, not as a traditional thing, not as something that represents most Afghans. In a way, the weird thing is that the Taliban's propaganda in some ways has been more successful outside of Afghanistan than inside Afghanistan. The Taliban's propaganda, especially both about representing kind of real Afghanistan, as it were, or traditional Afghanistan, but also in representing a kind of national liberation or resistance against foreign occupation or what have you. For example, if you watch the Brad Pitt movie War Machine, that was based on a book that was written about Stanley McChrystal that got Stanley McChrystal fired by the Rolling Stone journalist. By itself an atrocious thing, because he was an excellent general, and made a very positive impact on Afghanistan. In particular, for example, on reducing civilian casualties, but also on defeating the Taliban. But if you watch that movie, the Brad Pitt movie War Machine, very explicitly they present the Taliban as the kind of, oh, we just want to defend our country. I think it's quite. It makes me kind of personally angry to see that, but I think it should also make a lot of Afghans angry to see that the people in the West or other countries, I'm sure as well in Pakistan, who kind of claim to see themselves as the kind of protectors of the Afghans, and we're on your side, actually have been implicitly or explicitly supporting their enemies.
This was my view as well, but when I discussed it with the few tribal students who have been studying in here in Islamabad, and I talked to them and I asked them that, were you that radical Islamist or extremist previously? They say that our tribal society was not this kind of society that we are seeing now. This has become after the war.
Completely,
Yes, they
completely.
accept this.
Yeah, completely. I think you can see this very explicitly in the kind of if you read even academic study, anthropological studies, cultural studies from the kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. You see the 80s really the the fighting against the communists really accelerated this radicalism, partly in in terms of which groups were supported and so on, but also in the sense that chaos, violence, destruction has a kind of effect on any society to make it more extreme. In the sense that I think if fascism would not have taken over in Italy if it hadn't been for World War One. Nazism would not have taken over in Germany if it had not been for World War One and the Great Depression. And so there's a sense, I think, in which that the kind of psychological impact on a whole society of kind of sustained violence over a long time makes people, has the effect of kind of mainstreaming some of these kind of extremist ideas, because they offer a kind of a total solution. Say, we're gonna wipe everything clean, we're gonna have we're gonna bring back order, we're gonna sort it out. That said, again, these were, even after the 80s, even after the 90s, were not broadly popular in Afghanistan. They went from being sort of extremely minute interest to being a minority interest, but a substantial minority interest.
Yes.
In the same way that you can see that in sort of other extreme movements in other countries. And again, the appeal was that we have this pure vision of the past that we're going to bring back into the future. The weirdness of it, I think, Ahmed Rashid, the Pakistani journalist, points out this very well when he talks about not just him, but also Olivier Roy, written a lot on this, points this out about, especially in the 1990s, when a lot of the Taliban foot soldiers were essentially orphans who had studied in madrasas in the border areas, and then kind of got and had lived almost their whole lives just in this kind of madrasa setting, and then were kind of brought in as Taliban foot soldiers. And as for that matter, after they took over, they would be, the enforcers in the Vice and Virtue Ministry and so on. Obviously, these guys were kind of coming in and saying, we're going to bring back this vision of this pure, traditional village society, despite the fact that they never experienced that. Right? They had no idea how that, they had no traditions for themselves, right? They had no roots, and so the fact that they had no roots was, in a way, why they were such good foot soldiers for the Taliban. As they say, here's your kind of ersatz, artificial roots that that you've been looking for, despite the fact that it's a kind of it's a warped, twisted version of the reality.
One thing here I would like to add, Stephen. I was talking to this, a scholar from Pakistan, and who he has worked very much on, religious extremism in Pakistan, especially. And he was of the view that when after the Mughal Empire and after when the Muslims lost, in the India, and there was this majority, I'm just talking about in a Pakistani context, then I would come again to in Afghan context. So when they were they were not rulers, they were being told that you have lost your traditions, the society that back you had in times, and these were the rules, these were the traditions. You are not following the footsteps of our ancestors. That's why you are not the ruler and you are being ruled. That's how it was being told to the Afghan society, that was being inculcated in the Afghan society, that this is not you. The actual you, the Muslims, the Muslim rulers were like, they were that much strict in their in their views, in their following of Islam, that that's one of the reasons that you have fallen. And this was being told to the Afghan students who were studying in Pakistan back at time.
Completely.
Yeah.
But so I think that I mean, this is a big driver for the kind of growth of radical Islamism, as in, in the kind of version of Said Qutb, and especially, is that there is this sense that we have fallen behind. I mean, not just
and we
more
for
broadly that.
nostalgic past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Said Qutb's answer to that is we should, when we were kind of we need to go back to the kind of the original society of the Prophet Muhammad, when it was kind of pure, and we need to recreate that, and everything in between is a kind of a distortion.
Yes,
so
that's
essentially,
purism.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right. I mean, this is the meaning of the word Salafi, and obviously, there are many different versions of this purism, right? So some Salafis are at odds with the Taliban and the Bandis, so it's not kind of all one thing, but there are different attempts to do the same kind of intellectual jump, which is to say we're going to just go back to how it was in the year 600 or something, when everything was pure and good and so on. But obviously the problem with that is, despite the fact that there's quite a lot of religious texts and theologians of describing how were things in the year 600, we actually don't know. And if you look at
and that totally depends on the translations that were being done.
Exactly.
Yeah, they were out of they were being done. The literal meanings were being found out, that what are the literal meanings we need to follow. The message was not being followed, the words were being followed.
Exactly. And I mean, again, I mean, I'm not in a position to tell you or anyone else what the correct version of Islam is. That would be a crazy thing for me to do. But if you go back to the kind of the public debate in Afghanistan, I mean, which is what I'm studying, in the 1960s, you see feminists saying, actually, if you look at the Prophet Muhammad society, look at Khadija, she had an important role. Look at many other women in that society, they had an important role. So it's not in accordance with the message of that society that we should be staying at home and not playing an important role in society. We need to also build a nation. You have other people saying, actually, if you look at how we interpret that, the way that society was actually broadly democratic, that the Prophet's companions would get together and they would discuss things, and then they would agree things in a kind of a proto-parliamentarian way, right? So actually the message here is democracy. And then you have other people again, like the Islamists, the Said Qutb, saying, actually, what this means is we should have a revolution, almost like a Leninist revolution, and we should wipe away everything old, and everything we've done for the last 1,000 years is corrupt, and we need to go back to a kind of a sort of theocratic or anarcho-theocratic way of running society that's very different from these other things. But I think the interesting thing about that is that almost everyone, except the communists, were appealing to a sort of a historical or interpretation, and I think it's crazy to assume that the kind of the Islamists have a monopoly on that historical interpretation or theological interpretation, for that matter. Or at least as an outsider, I would say that seems strange that they are the only ones to get to have an opinion on this. Because there's a feminist argument, even to say that actually you guys, the Taliban or Al Qaeda or the Muslim Brotherhood, you are not acting in accordance with the message. Again, I'm not in the position to say which one is correct, but there is a much broader discussion here to be had. Or certainly historically there has been a much broader discussion. And I think what happened as a result of the very, very, very brutal war in Afghanistan in the 1980s and early 1990s is that a lot of that nuance, a lot of the kind of the multiplicity of views, a lot of the ability for some people to live in one way and other people to live in one way, and the cities to do one thing and the countryside to do one thing, and one valley to do one thing and another valley to do the other thing, that was kind of wiped away and replaced by this much more extreme, much more intolerant way of approaching these complex, difficult questions, often without a very strong link to the actual traditions, but with a strong link to a kind of an idea about what the traditions might have been from someone who grew up in a madrasa and had never experienced those traditions themselves. In a way, I think it's a broader warning about the danger of a society kind of losing its roots, through war or destruction or all these things. Because what happens when you kind of lose your roots, you get unfettered in a way, is that anyone and everyone, extremists can come in and say, "Well, here are your real roots," like you point out, here are your real roots to do this crazy thing, right?
If we look at that, there was a generational gap. In the 60s, there was the Afghan Republic's democratic, that constitutional monarchy was being brought into the system. But when the war comes in, then there is this generational gap, and the next generation, is being taught to fight. Fight for different principles, for different for something that was not part of that culture, but was not part of that society.
Completely.
So
but I think
the whole generation got wiped out. New generation comes in, and that is their tradition, what was being taught to them in madrasas.
And so there is a kind of a loss of memory in a way, or a loss of kind of muscle memory, or kind of how do we do this. But at the same time, if you so I think one of the most interesting intellectuals in the 1970s, 1980s in Afghanistan is a guy called Bahauddin Majru, Said Bahauddin Majru. There's a Sufi, but also kind of a university-trained professor of literature. So he had lived in France for a while, but he was also very connected to the kind of the traditional culture. He had been the head of the Department of Literature for a while in Kabul University. Had not been kind of caught up in the by either the communists or the Islamists who were dominating many of the other university departments in the 60s and 70s. And he ran this information bulletin in the 80s that was kind of almost like it was very explicitly for a long time, it was trying to not take any sides between the different Mujahideen parties. So it was based in Peshawar, where the resistance was headquartered. But then in 1987, he did something a bit risky, and he did a poll of a large-scale poll, about 2,000 refugees from that time who were in the large refugee camps in Pakistan, and asked, when this war is over, how would you like Afghanistan to be ruled? Who should rule it? And about 70% of the people who answered that poll said, we would like the king back. We'd like King Tsar to return. We'd like it to return to how it was before the coup in 1973. We're very happy with that. That was a good kind of medium. About 20% said, we don't care who it is as long as it's a Muslim. So essentially, there's not a strong ideological perspective. It's basically just saying, as long as this is someone, we don't object to, it's fine. About 9% said they wanted a pure Islamic society. So something, according to the kind of Hezb Islami Islamist view, or the Taliban, or something like that. And that roughly corresponds to today.
Because that idea was seeping in the society. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's seeping in, right? It's 10% rather than 1 or 2%, but it's still a small minority. And to the extent that we can extrapolate this across Afghanistan, but it's probably not widely off, right? And then less than 1% wanted any of the Mujahideen leaders to rule, or any of the Mujahideen commanders. But what it suggests is that even after that decade of war, most people in Afghanistan, I'm not speaking, my opinion there, but this is just the data. most people were saying, we want to have a moderate constitutional monarchy led by the king, as it was in the 70s, where people can live and let live, and none of this extremist stuff. That was the
Here,
vast majority wanted that.
if you would allow me to speak here,
Yeah, sorry.
I would just like to see things in a different from a different point of view. When in the if you take a look at that side of the region, especially Sawat region that is in direct border with Afghanistan, this part was you see so much
Mm,
Buddhist Buddhist sort of history there. So I think from that, I was just going through a few of your articles, a few of your writings, and here you mentioned that the Islam that was previously being practiced in Afghanistan, that was a totally milder one, Sufi
mm,
mystical Islam, tolerant Islam. And just a thought came into my mind that when you take a look, most of the the runes that you find in that area, they are the Buddhist runes.
mm, mm,
And it means that the people here were Buddhist, most of them, and they were more mystical, they were
mm,
more tolerant. If
mm,
you just take it back to centuries ago, these things, they are not they can be attached to
mm,
this radical Islamism, cannot be just
mm,
fixed to Afghanistan. This is what
completely.
I get from.
Completely
Yeah.
agree. I mean, the simplest, I think the most kind of tangible evidence of this is that you had all these ancient relics. I mean, not just Buddhist, right? But they've had the ancient Greek relics, pictures of Apollo and all these things, even Hindu things, especially in the area around Kabul, and all these ancient statues and symbols and whatever. They have remained for 1,000 years after Afghanistan became Islamic, around 900 year 1,000 or so on. They remained there. During that entire period, whatever traditional society was like, oh, that's interesting, great, let's keep it. This is beautiful things from the past. And then in the 1990s, this is the same time as the Spice Girls, right? It's very recent. The Taliban comes in and says, we are the guardians of traditional Afghanistan, so we're going to destroy all these things that have been there for 1,000 years. And that's what they did, right? I mean, not just the Buddhas. They went into the museum in Kabul with baseball bats and destroyed things, right? Destroyed these priceless ancient things that had been there for 1,000 years, right? I mean, well, they've been there for 2,000 years, but they've been there for 1,000 years after Afghanistan became Muslim. So I mean, if you tell me someone, if someone goes into my house, right, and they say, we're going to destroy the things that have been in that house for 1,000 years because we're the protectors of tradition, I mean, you have to be mentally ill to believe that. I mean, it's insane, right? But that's what these guys do, right? And then they go around to the rest of the world and say, look at us, we are the traditional, we are the guardians of tradition in Afghanistan, and what the republic or what the king or what all these people have been trying to do, that's just foreign interference, and you have to leave us in charge. I mean, it is totally insane. It is totally insane. But somehow they've been able to get away with
But
it.
the Europeans and NATO have bought that idea, and most of the world countries, Pakistan even, they have bought this idea.
Yeah. I think in the West, I think it's divided, but I think especially a lot of the kind of the anti-war lobby, as it were, have kind of bought this idea, and obviously also impacts. I mean, so the stuff that's much more kind of in the news on a daily basis when it comes to women's rights, and of course, I mean, Afghanistan has had a history of very, very, very conservative gender relations. So Taliban are not the kind of the first ones to be thinking that to have very conservative or very reactionary views on gender. But the difference, the radical difference with Taliban is these things have never been put into law, right? So if you went into the 1950s, right, when Prime Minister at the time Dawood and King Zahir were actively taking steps to kind of have more liberal gender relations in the cities, where women going to work and so on and so forth, they weren't actually changing any laws, right? Because none of this was prohibited. They were just saying they were with a personal example. They would go to the independence celebration and bring their wife along without the face covered, and it would be the queen. And then people were saying, "Oh, okay, well, if the king is doing it, I guess it's fine." And then people would kind of follow on a voluntary basis, as it were, right? And if you look if you looked at 20 different villages across Afghanistan in 1950, you would have a range of different ways of things happening, right? Somewhere people would be very, very, if some guests came from outside, the women would go by themselves and would be very, very segregated. Other places, it would be much more laid back. But again, it reflects this kind of diversity, multiplicity, but also the idea that you kind of live and let live, and they do that, we do that, that's fine, and we're not going to kind of bother with it. What the Taliban is doing is, I'd say, they're doing two things. One is they're now trying to upend gender norms that most Afghans don't identify with. You can see this again from polling data. It's not my opinion, but the data shows it, that most people think this is crazy. Something like 80 or 90% of people being asked while Doha negotiations were going on were saying, if the Taliban wants to end education for girls, we should not accept that. That should be a red line that we should not cross. So very, very, very unpopular idea across society as a whole. But the other thing that is completely radical is an attempt from the top to impose it on everyone, right? To say, here's how we're going to do this, and everyone has to do it this way. The only people who have done that in the past are the communists. I mean, not even all the communists, but the most radical faction of the communists, the Khalq communists, for a short time in the kind of late 70s, were saying we're going to go to every village and they're going to do it our way. So in a way, the Taliban, in their kind of approach to this, not in the content, but their how are we going to do this, how are we going to impose this, in a way have more in common with the communists than they have with the king or with traditional forms of government in Afghanistan, which I think reflects some of their kind of the way in which politically, as well as socially and culturally, it's a very radical movement. It's a modern movement. It's a movement that it's a movement of the late 20th century and the 21st century, not the movement of the kind of the primordial pure past.
But
I'm sure you're seeing some of the same things in. Sorry.
I would say even the Saudis have started modernization now, and Afghan society is going back. You know what they have been fed.
Completely.
Here, I can't. I'm not there. The Saudis, I can't have any influence in the Saudi government. But if I had, I would have told them that please change the Afghan society as well, the way you have changed them previously. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the last 20 years, I think there's a related to this misconception about the Taliban as being a kind of the norm, as it were, in Afghanistan, which is, again, crazy. I mean, these were guys that ruled for 3-4 years in most of the country by the time of 2001. Right? They were not people that had a long tradition of governance. But this
was the minority. How would this? Sorry, this was the minority, Stephen.
Yeah.
And how a minority can claim that these are our traditions? Majority always claims that this is totally insane in case of Taliban.
Yeah. But I think, I mean, even in conservative areas where, irrespective of the Taliban, people might have been skeptical about sending their daughters to school, for example. I mean, that would have been the case in some rural areas still is the case, even if they, they would still find it very strange that the government would come and dictate that, right? So there's a, there's a kind of that's the central government's business, right? So there's now alongside that, there's been a massive shift, or not even so much a shift, but a kind of a continuation of the trends that were already happening prior to the 1980s, where education was expanding, women's role was expanding, and so on. I think the other way of looking at this is, which I think is often kind of underappreciated. I'll use a story about my, it reflects also changes, I think, in the West. So my grandmother in Norway, she grew up on a farm in Western Norway, big farm, where it was a big kind of family-run farm, and everyone worked on that farm, right? Men, women, everyone. When she grew up, there was still, the inheritance was still in the male line. So the oldest son would inherit the farm, not the oldest child. That changed in the 1960s in Norway. But nevertheless, everyone in that farm was kind of, when they were getting the sheep in, everyone would help. When they were doing the sharing, when they're doing all the stuff, right? So it's like it's kind of a family company where everyone has a role. And that's obviously the same if you went to an Afghan village in the 1930s or the 1950s or whatever, you would not find women who are not working, right? Because you can't afford not to have everyone work. Everyone's doing it. Everyone's playing an important role. Everyone's doing something. And in the same way that when my grandmother married
in India as well.
Exactly.
This was the case in India as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but when my grandmother in Norway got married and moved to the suburbs with her husband at the time, who was a teacher, the norm at that time was that she would be a kind of a housewife, and so she would be at home and looking after the kids before they went to school, and tidying and cleaning and whatever. And for her, I know this because I spoke about this, but my grandmother, no, she hated it, because it was like she had grown up with quite a big important role for not just her but for all the women, right? They're involved in everything, to having this very small role, and with a lot less community and a lot less kind of value and so on. And obviously this is happening at the same time in Afghanistan in the 1950s, 1960s, because you have urbanization. You have people moving into the cities, and therefore and men starting to work in offices, and so the work is moving from the home. Instead of you're living and working on a farm, you're living in a house and you're working in an office or a factory or wherever, right? And that's when you see, in the same way as this is when you see the kind of feminist movement emerge in the West, this is also when you see the feminist movement emerge in Afghanistan, because people are saying, well, are these women just going to sit at home all day? This doesn't make any sense. It's not only is it demeaning, because it's not a good way to live. I mean, anyone who lived through COVID and tried to sit home all day and never leave the home, I mean, knows how terrible this is, right? But also, it's also wasting half of the society, right? So King Zahir, Dawood, all these guys were saying this. It was like, we can't become a developed country, have economic development, become release our potential, as it were, if all these educated women, all the middle class women are just sitting at home and doing nothing, right? So this is why this is happening in the 1950s and 1960s, because they see that and in a way the Taliban are trying to kind of adopt a model for the cities that was tried very briefly and found very briefly to be completely non-functional, right? Because again, right, if you said the women are going to work at home, that works if you're working in a farm, because then all the work is at home, right? If you get into the city, that doesn't work, because very little of the work is at home, and so
that makes sense. Yeah.
And it mirrors. It's not unique to Afghanistan. It mirrors what's happened everywhere else. I mean, again, Norway is known for being very gender equal, but this was my grandmother's experience, right? So she actually moved back to a farm with her. She convinced her husband, my grandfather, to move back to a farm because she hated being a housewife. But that's a kind of besides the point. That those changes have happened in Afghanistan, right? So in the 1990s, when the Taliban took over Kabul for the first time, the majority of people working in hospitals were women. Right? And during the 80s, the majority of people who were studying were women, who were getting higher education were women, because so many of the men were out fighting the war, either on the part of the government or on the part of the Mujahideen. So you have this this actually very modern, as it were, distribution of who has professional qualifications, who are running the hospitals, the schools, everything, but also other things that was then kind of being upended, and obviously after 2001 that continued, right? It continued on the same path that it continued since the 1950s and the 1960s, not in a new way that was kind of imposed by NATO, but in the way that always done throughout the kind of modern period. And what the Taliban are doing again now is a kind of a disruption to that. It's an anomaly. It's a kind of going in a weird new direction that has no precedent.
Okay, Stephen, would you like me to move into the second part, or would you like
let's
to
do that.
do it
Let's do that.
in another
No,
podcast?
let's talk about that now. Yeah. Sorry, I went on for a bit longer than.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's all right. So the next part that we would be going to discuss is why Afghan forces retreated. What were the reasons? They sometimes they are being they have been blamed that they were just Americans left Afghanistan, or they quit Afghanistan. NATO evacuated Afghanistan, and quite suddenly, and that was very that was being thought that this was not being expected. We have invested so much in the Afghan forces, and they haven't been up to our expectations. So, and they suddenly surrendered and gave up, and the Kabul fell. That's the common perspective that have been fed to the people, to the layman. Is that true that Afghan forces just suddenly lost, or they were just not, this is not a fair statement to say.
I think it's a terrible lie that the Afghan forces weren't willing to fight. It makes me very angry and very sad to hear that. And unfortunately, it's a very convenient lie for the people who wanted to argue that it was a good thing for us to leave it behind because they didn't want this anyway. And it fits with what we talked about earlier, when a lot of the kind of Western anti-war lobby, as it were, have been kind of trying to more or less implicitly or explicitly say that the Taliban represent the real Afghanistan. The reality is the West pulled out most of its troops from Afghanistan in 2013 and 2014. So when I was in Afghanistan during that period, the main thing we were doing was pulling out troops. So NATO and the coalition allies had about 160,000 troops at the peak, sort of 2011, 2012. And by 2014, that had been reduced by 90%. So there were 15,000, 20,000 troops left in Afghanistan. Almost all of the Western combat troops, the troops actually doing fighting, had been pulled out. And what was left intentionally was advisors and logistics, a bit of intelligence support and air support, to not to do fighting, but to help the Afghans do the fighting. And help the Afghans do the fighting basically by themselves, which they did, starting in 2012, 2013. By 2013, the Afghans were doing most of the operations by themselves. That is, 10 years ago now. By 2014, 2015, there were basically no Western combat units left other than a few special forces. And obviously, they can have a big impact, and the Western air support had a big impact, and so on. But that is really when the Afghan security forces took over the fight. 10 years ago. And after that point, they led the war. They did 99% of the fighting from 2014 or 2013 to the end in 2021, taking about
So
70,000 casualties.
Then this is the disrespect saying that they haven't been fighting.
Completely,
They were not ready to fight.
completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's enormously disrespectful, and I mean, it's especially disrespectful to the 70,000 soldiers and officers who lost their lives, who gave their lives in this fight. So I mean, we often talk about the Western casualties, right? So the Western coalition lost about 3,500 soldiers. The Afghan security forces lost 20 times as many. So I mean, it's an enormous disproportion of Afghan soldiers and Afghan officers, Afghan police who fought this war, and they did so with Western support, and that was intentional. And they deserved that support from the way they were fighting. But they paid an enormous price to keep fighting, and they did keep fighting because they saw this as being protecting their country, and that was completely the right thing. It's even more disrespectful. I mean, it's also enormously disrespectful to the many more who got wounded, the many families that are left behind, who had one of their loved ones lose their lives, and also the many soldiers who today survived but fought hard for many years and are living in hiding today from the Taliban, who are trying to hunt down these men, because they want to take revenge, or they're worried about what might happen in the future, and so on and so forth. They're living in extremely difficult conditions, with both in terms of the security situation, because often they have to move houses and keep one step ahead of the Taliban who are searching for them, but also it's very difficult in that situation to earn an income, right? To feed yourself, your family, to stay alive, and the notion that these guys, who sacrificed so much for so many years, are then being spoken about by, especially by people in other countries, saying, they didn't really care. Actually, people just wanted the Taliban back, whatever. I mean, it is infuriating. It's a terrible lie. It's a convenient lie for the people who engineered the Doha deal, for the people who engineered the withdrawal afterwards. But it's but I think it's beyond disrespectful to talk about the Afghan security forces.
They basically set up a trap for the Afghan forces.
Yeah. So I think if we talk a little bit about what happened in 2020 and 2021, I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is that the Americans wanted the Taliban to win, and they kind of set up a trap, as you say. The other way, I think, I understand very well why people think that's the case, but I don't think it's quite true. I think what the Americans wanted to do was to pull away support from the Afghan forces to force the Afghan government to compromise with the Taliban. I mean, they have explicitly, there's lots of evidence for this, that they were sort of saying, okay, we'll take away this support, we'll take away this support, we'll take away this support, so that we know that they, they'll struggle, and then they'll come to their senses, and they'll make a compromise. They'll shake hands with Taliban, and everything will be fine. It was a disastrous miscalculation, because they didn't realize how stubborn Ghani was, to his credit or not to his credit, depending on how you look, but how stubborn he was. Also, how much he underestimated the progress that the Taliban were making in the field. But also, I think more fundamentally, it underestimated the effect to which, these things are not kind of a precise, it's not like you're working in a chemical laboratory and you can say, okay, we're going to take, 2 milliliters of this and 2 milliliters of this, and we're going to have this temperature, whatever. It's very, you cannot kind of precisely engineer these things. And at the end of the day, especially when Biden came in, I think to some extent Trump as well, but Trump decided on this deal and decided on this plan, and then Biden basically decided we're going to pull out no matter what, even if they completely collapse. So he clearly didn't care about the consequences if the Afghan government failed, if they were not able to, and so I think it's not quite well. It could be, I don't know, but I don't think it's an intentional thing from the Americans that the Taliban won. But I think it was a mixture of miscalculation and not giving a shit. I mean, they were like, well, if they collapse, and we'll deal with Taliban. And that I think is a terrible betrayal. And I know, especially a lot of the American forces who were in Afghanistan, and especially the ones who served alongside the Afghan forces. I mean, they are so furious about this and so heartbroken about this, because they also saw their own, both their Afghan friends, but also their American friends fight and die for this cause. And then suddenly, they too were betrayed by Trump and then Biden, in the way that the kind of the rug was pulled. And maybe just to be a little bit more clear about exactly what happened, because people say this, well, the Afghans had all this support, had all this money and so on, so how did the Taliban kind of take over? I mean, three things happened that were very, very important. The first was that air support was taken away. And people say, well, why does that matter? The Taliban didn't have air support. Well, the Afghan military was very intentionally set up with very light weapons. So they had very little artillery, they had very little heavy vehicles, etc., because they were then saying, okay, all the heavy fires we're going to get from the air. It's a better way of doing it because Afghanistan is a large country. It's got very difficult infrastructure. So this is easier, faster, whatever. The Taliban, obviously, they had a different approach because they didn't have air power, but they would often bring in quite heavy fires, heavy artillery to use on their side. But that's the one thing. The second thing that was perhaps even more important was, after the Doha deal, the Americans pressured the Afghan forces to basically adopt a defensive posture, which means that they gave the Taliban a free hand to kind of do whatever they wanted. So they're able to isolate, surround a lot of outlying bases. They're able to cut off supply lines. They're able to move around freely and amass forces, amass supplies, amass weapons in different areas of Afghanistan without the Afghan army being able to disrupt that. So prior to that, I mean, if you were the Taliban, you would have to be very circumspect about how you moved around. You would constantly worry about airplanes. You would be constantly worrying about whether your supply base was being taken out, about patrols and so on. But suddenly all of that stopped, and they could, it's like we have a saying in Norway: when the cat is away, the mice dance on the table. And this is really what happened in 2020. The Afghan forces were saying, no, you're going to stay put in your base, and Taliban can do whatever. So they were able to kind of really get into the perfect position to do things. What that meant was that all of these hundreds of bases that are all around Afghanistan, because if you're the government, you have to have a presence everywhere, right? If you don't have a presence, Taliban can come in. A lot of them were suddenly unable to be supplied with ammunition, food, water, everything by land, because Afghan security forces hadn't been able to move around, haven't been able to do attacks, so Taliban could cut off the supply lines, which meant that they had to be supplied by air. But the air support from the Americans had been taken away. So you had a very small Afghan Air Force that were doing all of this supplying, right? So they were flying around with their helicopters day and night to supply all these bases that are in, all over outlying areas that have been surrounded, been kind of concentrated on. That worked, and the Taliban were still not able to make big advances until early 2021. But then when the final decision came in April from Biden that we're going to pull out everything, absolutely everything, no matter what happens, they also pulled out the maintenance support, not the American soldiers, but the private companies that were maintaining the Afghan helicopters. And part of the reason why these helicopters were maintained by private companies were that the Americans had insisted the Afghans use American technology, because despite the fact that it requires much more maintenance, and they're saying you have to use that, but we'll supply with the maintenance. Don't worry about it. We'll never take it away. But if you take away all the maintenance people for a Black Hawk helicopter or a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, etc., it's a matter of very short time until that plane or helicopters, you cannot fly it anymore. So even the American generals who were advising, they were saying, this is worrying. We shouldn't do this, because if we do this, by September, not a single plane of the Afghan Air Force will be able to fly anymore. Right, and the Biden administration said, yeah, doesn't matter, we'll do it, and hopefully we'll pressure the Ghani administration to make a deal. But obviously, by this point, the Taliban themselves, they're saying, actually, maybe we can win this, so there's no point for us to do a deal. So kind of the miscalculation has turned into a kind of a complete disaster. And then meanwhile, while this is happening, the Americans have also pressured the Afghans to release 5,000 prisoners. This is some of the most hardcore prisoners that Taliban have. These are the guys that have been caught in all those nitrates, right? That the Americans and the Afghans and other countries as well have been doing for years and years and years. They're very controversial, created lots of trouble, right? They did all these nitrates because they said these guys are really dangerous. It's not like your random kind of
the troublemakers were released.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not the kind of the rank and file Taliban, farmer who maybe fights for a couple of months and then goes back to his farm. These are like hardcore terrorists who have been planning really complex operations. Some of them have been, infiltrated units and done these like infiltration attacks. These were people who had planned bombings of hospitals for children. Terrible people. Unless you're a jihadist, and people who could really make a difference on the battlefield. They were taken out within a few months of these people being released. The Afghan forces were capturing them again. Right. So when they were doing this, when they were discussing in Doha, the agreement was, we'll release these people, but we promise they will go back to the village. They won't do anything more. It's just a matter of kind of building confidence in the peace talks, right? And the Taliban said, we'll release some prisoners as well, because they had 1,000 prisoners. And when the prison exchange happened, this was under a lot of time pressure, and the Americans were kind of putting pressure on the Afghan government putting pressure on the guys that were doing the vetting. And they were finding people, the so-called kind of Afghan security forces prisoners that were being released by the Taliban as a confidence building measure. They were like looking at the ID cards and was like, this guy is a 13-year-old farmer, and it says he's a police captain. What is happening here, right? So the Taliban, they were kind of running circles around the Americans in the negotiations at this point, right? They're giving away nothing and getting really, really important concessions. Now, at the same time, if you're looking at the kind of the morale, this is a terrible impact on the morale of the Afghan forces, who are, they're seeing American aircraft in the air while they're being attacked by Taliban. The American aircraft are doing nothing, right? So they're saying, okay, we've been abandoned, and they're capturing guys who they're captured previously 2 years ago, right? We're fighting them, and so rumors start going around. They're saying, in the Doha, they're gonna give certain provinces to the Taliban. They're gonna, do this and that, and whatever, and so there's an undermining of the kind of the trust in keeping going. Nevertheless, they do keep going, right? So the desertion rate at this point is going up a little bit. More people are maybe taking a deal from the Taliban. Maybe their family is being pressured or something. So there's more like individual soldiers and so on. But once you get into early 2021, and especially after the contractors for the aircraft get taken away, what happens is that a lot of these bases, you have hundreds of these bases across Afghanistan. They're literally running out of ammunition, and they're running out of water, and they're running out of food. I've spoken to many, even where they weren't running out of it, right? They were always short on ammunition. They were short on food. They're eating field rations that have gone out of date. They're drinking dirty water. In some places they're emptying the radiator fluid of their vehicle to get drinking water, rather than surrender. Right. So this is, these are committed guys, right? If you haven't been drinking water in June in Afghanistan for 2 days, it's hot. Right? It is really, really hot, right? Your base is surrounded by the Taliban, and you have been surrounded for a month because there are no offensive operations happening against the Taliban. You're not getting air support because the airplanes are not being maintained, so they can't fly anymore, and you're not getting supply.
What would be your morale? And you would expect them to be, fighters.
You would expect it to be extremely poor, right?
Their morale?
So exactly,
Yeah.
but in fact, they keep going. They keep going for a long time, right? They keep going for 18 months after the Doha deal. They keep going for months and months after the final withdrawal kind of gets decided in April. The one big mistake that the Afghan government does display at this point is to not consolidate the forces a lot more. So there were quite a lot of officers, senior officers, talking about this in the Afghan military, saying we're going to have big trouble maintaining, supporting all these bases. We're going to get in a situation at some point where people are going to start surrender because they're surrounded, or they think they're going to lose, so they don't want to. They'd rather get safe passage rather than die and then lose anyway. So we need to withdraw from a lot of the outlying areas, concentrate on the key cities, the border crossings, and the major highways, and then we stabilize the situation and move on from there. If they had done that, maybe it would have worked. It's difficult. You don't know. It's a hypothetical, but there was a lot of reluctance to do that in the Ghani government. I think Ghani himself was not. He did not understand how precarious the situation had become, and even until the final announcement in April 2021, most Americans even didn't actually believe that they were going to pull out everything. They didn't believe that they were going to take the contractors. They didn't believe that. They thought maybe this will keep going for a few years, because the Doha deal itself said that the final withdrawal would be conditions based. So even though both Trump said, okay, we're going to do it by this date, and then we're going to do it by this date, those dates were still conditional on progress in the peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. But what happened in April 2021 was Biden said, I don't care about the conditions. We're going to pull out no matter what, and we're going to pull out immediately. So So a lot of the Green Berets who were at this point, this is special forces who were kind of advisor teams for the different Afghan units. They saw this on TV and they were like, oh my God, we're leaving now. We had no idea because they obviously thought there was a possibility that it might happen, but they really were taken by surprise. Even the Americans kind of on the ground in the military, because they thought they would stay a lot longer. And then the Afghan military as well were especially caught by surprise when the contractor support was taken away and all these things. Because at this point as well, you see a bit of a rupture in the way that the Americans are they're starting to just pull things out without really conferring with the Afghans and making a plan together. So, for example, when Bagram Air Base was taken away, this used to be the biggest logistics hub in all of Afghanistan. Right? This was and there's a prison, by the way, inside with before the fall there was a prison with several thousand Taliban prisoners, but also several thousand ISKP prisoners, ISIS prisoners, right, and Al Qaeda prisoners. And these are the guys that the Americans were saying, "Oh, Taliban will help us, fight these guys." So when they withdraw from Bagram, they don't even tell the commander at Bagram Air Base, the American commander. He doesn't tell the new commander from the Afghans is going to take over that base when they're going to do it. So the Afghans are outside the base and they see suddenly the lights go off, and then there are looters coming into the base. And it's not until the next morning at 7 a.m. that they get into Bagram Air Base. And at that point, they're fighting off people who are kind of coming in and looting the equipment and looting the stuff, because they haven't even been told that they're taking over the base, right?
Yeah.
And at this point, yeah. Sorry.
That was in a way funny and chaotic as well. What was
exactly
happening, and the people were they were climbing on the planes
Yeah, yeah,
They were
yeah, yeah,
falling from the planes
yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
yeah. I mean,
That
that
was
was
quite tragic.
that was happening. I mean, that was happening in Kabul a month later. When the civilian evacuation, but Bagram, I mean, it's the airbase that's
Yeah, 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 yeah,
a
yeah,
little
yeah.
bit of a drive outside Kabul in the north.
I have
But
seen that
the
documentary as well. I
yeah,
have seen
exactly,
that
with
documentary as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
with the retrograde.
yeah,
But when but the way this happened, I mean, it further kind of fueled these rumors that, so at this point people start thinking, actually maybe the Americans have switched sides. Maybe they're definitely not our allies anymore, because they're not even telling us what they're doing, right? They're not even cooperating with us, they're not helping us. We have Taliban attacking our base, and the airplanes are in the sky above us and they're not doing anything. I mean, it would have been better not to have any planes at all, right? But they're like there, then they're looking at us and they're not doing anything. So clearly they are okay with this happening. So obviously this is also fueling then the kind of the loss of morale. And at some point, during kind of late July, late June, early July, you start to see a kind of collapse beginning. But even at this point, I mean, and a lot of these outlying bases have been fighting very hard for a very long time, and they're, I mean, literally running out of water or ammunition. So I mean, it's before they're surrendering, and then they make a deal and they say, okay, we'll get safe passage or whatever. But once that start happening, it becomes a cascade, right? Because if you then lose a lot of your forces out in the countryside, suddenly you don't have that many forces on the close to the cities. And then way too late, I mean, early August, the Afghan government starts saying, okay, fine, we're going to do this consolidation. We're going to pull the troops in from the countryside. We're going to concentrate on a few cities. But at this point, they've already lost tens and tens of thousands of soldiers from this fighting in the countryside, from the bases being surrounded, finally surrendering. And then what was intended to be a kind of a more of a tactical concentration or consolidation then becomes a rout. And then more and more of the kind of mid-level governors, senior commanders, etc., start to think, okay, the game is up. And they start switching sides or surrendering, often much more quickly than the soldiers themselves. In other places, the senior commanders keep going until the very end. But there's a dynamic there where, especially on the kind of local politicians and so on, where if you're thinking everyone, at this point everyone has a deal from the Taliban, right? Taliban has offered, if you just let us in the city, not fight, we'll give you $1 million, send you to Dubai, and you can live in peace and in retirement. If you think you're the only person considering that deal, you're never going to take it, right? But if you think everyone else is going to take that deal, and then the Taliban are going to take all their forces and just take my village or my town, then that's very difficult, right? So there's a sense of like, once it starts to crumble, it starts crumbling very fast. So that's what you see from kind of August 12th, 13 to August 15th when Kabul was taken. I mean, 5 days before Kabul was taken, only a few cities in all of Afghanistan have been lost. And that's often is misconstrued, saying, and people say, oh, the whole country fell in a week. It's like, no, the whole country kept going for a year and a half, until it was kind of completely out of steam because all the support had been taken away. And the things that are happening during that period, I mean, from the Afghan forces side, I mean, it's really, really heroic resistance in a lot of cases, especially from the special forces, especially from a lot of the kind of the more elite units that were, they did not have water, they did not have support. Their wounded soldiers were not being evacuated. They're surrounded. Some of these guys were surrounded for a month at a time, and they still kept going.
yeah.
Um,
That's
and
that
the
I can,
sorry,
I'm having goosebumps that
yeah,
how the situation was, would be for them,
yeah,
like
yeah,
without
yeah,
the supplies. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So we
yeah,
would like to conclude, Stephen. Maybe we can have a,
yeah,
other podcast for the role of for the role of us
yes,
in Afghan war.
yes,
That we can discuss later on, and hopefully we have touched upon these two topics that were, very important. There were false narratives about this. One was, the how Afghan society was. The other one was that, that was a bit I'm calling it a disrespect. You know, I'm looking from their perspective, and if I'll take a look that how they would still feel, yeah, that they are being treated, that they are being, looked upon as cowards. Actually, they were not. They were heroes in that war.
100%.
So that's
Absolutely.
all. Thank you so much for your time. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye bye.
Likewise. Take care.